Of the three parts of an adventure, the social interaction portion tends to have the least amount of rules, but take up the most amount of time. So, let's talk about that. Hey fellow Game Masters, welcome back. I'm Richard Quiner, and today we're talking about social interactions in tabletop role-playing games. Before we get started, you'll notice this sweet little cut on my cheek. Lesson learned, no matter how many times you use a straight razor, never rush it, always be careful, and don't go waving it around. I can only hope that I get a nice dignified yet understated scar from this, but if we're being real, it's going to disappear in a couple weeks. Now, getting into social interactions in tabletop role-playing games, I want to make a little comparison between tabletop role-playing games and video games. I grew up kind of an avid video gamer, kind of under the radar with my family, but I played a lot of video games in my late teens to now. Still, I try to play video games as much as I can because they're fun and a good time. But the one thing that I always noticed, and everyone noticed this, your options are limited. When you have a social interaction in a video game, the computer has limited responses and you have limited options to pick from. And that was one thing that made games such as Fallout so great, is because they put a lot of effort and a lot of options in there for you, so you could really be flexible with your choices. But over the years that has diminished, and now I think one of the more socially interactive kind of heavy games out there is the Divinity series, where they have a lot of options and each option actually has an impact on the world. In tabletop role-playing games, this has never changed. You've always been able to say and do whatever you want in the game because it is between the player and the game master. It's not dealing with a computer, it's dealing with another person that is flexible and has a more creative mind. And that is one of the reasons why I came to love tabletop role-playing games so much, is that lack of restrictions. Now, when they were doing 5th edition D&D, they decided to make less rules for social interaction. They decided to make it a bigger part of the thing and encourage people to talk and play their characters out in a role-playing scenario. That was because they wanted to give players more freedom. The lack of rules equals more freedom in this case, and I think that does in most situations in the tabletop role-playing game world. So, we want to figure out how to embrace that, how to use that to our advantage as game masters and as players, and how we can also use the rules to help our game progress as well, because there's two sides to social interactions. There's the rules-heavy side, and there's the no-rules side. First off, we're going to talk about the no-rules side of social interactions. This is basically when you play your character, or you as the DM play the NPCs. This is the time where there are no rules, you're not rolling dice, you're just talking, you're having conversations with people, you're using your words to make something happen. And you see this a lot in the popular Critical Role, where the players stay in character the whole time, and they're able to say and do things that they want based on that, without a lot of rolling going on for those social moments. Critical Role has kind of set a standard that is kind of held at a bar that's pretty high. It's a pretty high bar to reach the Critical Role standard of social interactions in role-playing games. But that is not the only way to do it, and at most average games, most normal games, you won't have a lot of people that can get into their character and do voices and become and embody their characters. Most tables will have a few people who might be able to do that, but a few others who want to play the game and create these characters, but they might be limited on how much they can actually perform in any given situation. And the rules, the dice rolling, is there to allow players to play any character they want without having to become that character. But in these situations, when you're having conversations and everyone can get into characters, it is at your game master discretion how often to roll the dice. If a player can say and talk about the things they want and really get their point across, you don't have to make them roll for it. You can decide as the game master to just say okay and go with that decision. And that's fine. That's a good way to do it, because then the players feel like they're doing it and you're not pulling them out of the story just to roll some dice. The pros of this method of playing is it's very immersive. If one player can get into it and the other players follow suit and can get into that as well, and if everyone is kind of on the same page with the conversations, then the story can progress a lot more without a lot of die rolling, and I think that's a good thing. And I think anytime the players and you as the game master can get into the story and stay in there as long as possible, that's a plus. That's a win in my book. So If you can do that, great. Even though I say this is a great thing and this is fun, that's from my experience, it is a fun time to get into character and play this way. I also recognize and understand and encourage you to not say this is how it has to be played. Games like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder do not have one specific set rule of this is how it's played. A lot of times, in the past, people would go learn how to play at their local game shops, and it would pass down kind of a set of rulings or a standard of play that was different at each game shop, no matter where you went. And the big picture thing is, there is no right or wrong way to play it, and you should be flexible as a game master to allow multiple play styles at the table. Which brings us to the next part of these social interactions, and that is the more rules-heavy, dice-heavy way of doing it. This really caters to the type of players that they may want to play a bard, and just for clarification, a bard is generally someone who's very well spoken, they have a lot of charisma, they're pretty, they speak good all the time, and you might have a player that wants to play that character, but they themselves, in their real life, can't do that. And so they might struggle a bit. And this actually happened with me in my current game that I'm playing in. I play a rogue, but I chose to do a rogue that is very high charisma. He lies and persuades and intimidates. He can do all that. But when I first started playing, I was more socially awkward, and so that kind of became the character's thing. He's a socially awkward guy, but because the game master allowed me to roll on things, I was still able to get some stuff done. It wasn't because you can't perform this character that you're not this character. It was like, well, I can rely on the dice and on the rules. So the rules-heavy side of social interaction is basically you have the three main tasks of social interaction. You have persuasion, deception, and intimidation. Persuasion being when you want to convince someone to do something that you want them to do. Deception is lying to someone or bluffing, or as it says, deceiving, deception. And last, intimidation is basically bullying someone into submitting to what you want. The player may not have skills or be skilled in either any of those three things, but their character can be. And that is where the dice come into play. If a character wants to intimidate someone, they might not say the most intimidating thing at the table. They might just say, I would like to intimidate them. And that's fine, and then you say, okay, roll for your intimidation, and they roll and they tell you the number, and it makes it the game side of things. And this really allows for people who are not performers or are not into their character the same way that other people might be, to play the game and stay on the same level as their more performance-heavy counterparts. With the rise of Critical Role and the rise in popularity of D&D and Pathfinder, a lot of actors are getting into the game. And this is a great thing. I think it's a game for everyone. Everyone get in on this, right? But sometimes people can be intimidated by their acting, playing at a table with actors, and they could get a little intimidated when the actors get into characters and are able to say and do things that their characters would do, and they themselves are a little more shy or, kind of closed off, and they can't get into it the same way. This is where the dice rolling comes in, and I think it's a good thing to help and have at the table. In addition, a quick side note of this also works kind of on a vice versa scenario. When a player is so good at talking and so eloquent and clear and concise and can say things very well, but they decide to have a character that is kind of a mumbling, dumb, non-charismatic character, the dice can be used the opposite way. Because that character would have a low charisma score or a low stat in the social interaction way, even if the player does talk very well and is able to clearly define what they want, a roll could still be a negative thing for them, and so that comes into play in helping, people who are better at a certain subject than their character is, be more like their character. So keep that in mind as you're playing and doing things. Now, in role-playing games, you can do all of one or all of the other, or with the freedom of role-playing games, you can mash them together so you do kind of a hybrid of some of one and some of the other at different times. So things that for me as a GM, and I would like to share with you to think about when you're in these situations, and you can decide which is the best version of social interaction to use. So first thing, I think about each scenario individually and how important it is to the story. Is it a small social interaction when you're buying something at the blacksmith, and you're going to buy some daggers and move on? Or is it a situation where the characters are talking to the king or queen of a country and they're going to be deciding the fate of a whole big world? What is the weight of this social interaction moment? And then you can use that to decide how you want to handle it as the game master. Oftentimes, in my personal games, I like to do both ways, but if it's something like a little small, kind of innocuous, unimportant moment, the dialogue will just suffice, and if the players get into it and don't ask for rolls, I try. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I try to make it so whatever they say is how it works out, and they can have let the conversation play out. But if it's a big game-changing moment, I always try to think of a reason why, if this part went bad, it would still be a good story. I don't like to say, oh, if the part goes bad, then that's the end of the game. I want to say, okay, the story just changes and it flows a little different. So when it's a big situation, a lot of times I will have rolls come up. I will have the players try to use the dice to make that happen. This just introduced a little bit of randomness to the table. So in the situation where they're talking to a king or queen of a town or a country, and if they roll poorly and the queen or king decides they didn't like that, the whole dynamic can shift, and it can still make for a good story. All of this is about making for a good story. I try to do that in my games where all those big situations have one or two ways they can go, or even a third way they can go. I never try to, railroad the story into one path that works only. But that's just me, and you as the game master get to decide what works for you in each of those situations. I know I've mentioned a lot of the players' options and the players' choices in this, but it's important to remember that you as the game master have these options as well. Just because you're a game master doesn't mean you have to do voices and be funny and be this goofy character all the time, or these goofy NPCs. You can play it completely you and roll the dice to determine successes or failures for the NPCs as well. And it's really important you remember that because, like I've mentioned multiple times in these videos, the current attitude of role-playing games is to put situations in games such as Critical Role on such a high pedestal and say this is how it's played, but that's not the case. You as the game master run the game how you want to play it, and that is good enough for the game. Like, no one is going to tell you that's wrong unless they're a jerk. If they tell you you're doing it wrong, they're kind of a jerk. Just kind of a jerk. If you are the type that likes to perform and do voices, do it. If you are the type that doesn't want to do all that but still wants to run a game and tell a story, you can lean more heavily on the dice and let the randomness of the dice decide what's going on. All that being said, I tend to, kind of go all the different ways. Sometimes I'll have the NPCs roll, sometimes I'll just have them talk, sometimes the players will roll, sometimes they won't. And that's what I found works best for me and my table. And I do have these moments at times where I've had to tell the players just this last week, I was like, I love you guys are getting into role-playing, and they're having these in-character conversations at the table, but they were doing it where two people were talking and then two other people were talking, and there's a lot of crosstalk, and I couldn't hear it all. And I loved that moment because they were in it. They were role-playing their characters, they were embracing this, the role-play style, the role-play game, so to speak. But I had to pull them out to say, I want to hear what's going on, let's cut the crosstalk. And so it kind of hurt me a little bit inside to have to say that. But I think my players will be able to handle that and save the crosstalk and still be able to get into character. That's what I found out works at my table, is kind of the mix of the dice and the talking. That's what works for me. You decide what works for you. Wherever you're watching this, let me know in the comments what type of social interaction you enjoy at the table. Assuming now you've played at least one session with your group. And if you haven't played a session, which one sounds better? Let me know below. And of course, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.